Okay, the following is a little clip that is a discussion between one Thomas DeLauer and Layne Norton. It's about a minute long or minute and a half long clip regarding saturated fat and fructose. And I want you to take a listen to this, and then I'll have some commentary afterwards.
There's a lot of evidence too suggesting that the high amounts of saturated fat are also an equally strong contributor, if not, unfortunately, even a stronger contributor to insulin resistance than excess sugar, right?
Well, that's what people don't want to talk about. It's like when these people freak out about fructose and liver fat. Okay, but we have studies comparing straight up fructose overfeeding, saturated fat overfeeding. I think fructose overfeeding increased liver fat by like 20% or something like that. Which, by the way, wasn't really different from overfeeding any other source of carbohydrate. Saturated fat increased by like 78%. Yeah. They actually did a study where they overfed polyunsaturated fats versus saturated fats. I want to say it was a 78% greater increase in liver fat compared to polyunsaturated fats. You know what the big thing people always get hung up on that study when I talk about it? They're like, oh, well, they cooked them in muffins. You're really going to tell me that this study with muffins is good? I'm like, these are highly processed stuff that you guys freak out about, and they're with polyunsaturated fats, and they heated it, which is like, this is like the trifecta of everything that you guys say that seed oils are bad for, right? What happens when you replace it 1-to-1 saturated fat versus polyunsaturated fats? You either see a neutral or positive effect. So again, I'm not saying that people should completely avoid saturated fat. I'm just saying saturated fat appears to be somewhat problematic, especially if you're overeating it.
There's a lot of evidence too suggesting that the...
Okay, so first of all, I will be doing an interview with Thomas DeLauer sometime in February. So, I'll have an opportunity to maybe share some of this stuff as well if we go into that. And certainly in the past, I've had, a quote unquote debate, more like a friendly discussion with Layne Norton on the Mark Bell podcast. If you guys want to watch that, you're welcome to, and you can conclude who you think won or have any comments that you want. But one of the things that, a couple points that Layne is making here is that, fructose, at least in one study he cites, and this is a study here, and it's interesting about this study, is he states that, in this particular study, saturated fat was associated with a greater propensity to store fat within the liver, and that was a conclusion that he reaches, and had to say that's sort of the end of the discussion. However, the problem in that particular study, and it's not a problem, is that, and credit to Nick Norwitz, who also has a PhD like Layne, but he's also getting an MD from Harvard. He's got a PhD from Oxford and getting his MD from Harvard, so he's quite a bright fellow. And, in the analysis of the study, they found that what we saw was the fructose-laden cupcake or muffin, is what they used in this thing, had a much higher propensity to end up with much of that fat being shunted into the bloodstream via triglycerides and VLDL, which arguably might be a worse condition, depending on whose perspective you're looking at. So it's not as cut and dried as Layne puts it out to be there. And the other thing is that, he makes fun of the fact that, people are saying that this is a worse food, the muffin with the saturated fat that's been cooked. The problem with a lot of these things when you're assessing individual macronutrients, I suppose, or individual nutrients like saturated fat, polyunsaturated fats, things like that, that's not how we eat food. We don't sit down to a plate of saturated fat, right? Even myself, who consumes 98% right now, 100% of my diet is coming from beef, I'm consuming about 30% of my calories are coming from saturated fat. About 60% total is coming from fat, maybe 65%, and of that, about 45% of that of steak of the fat in steak is saturated fat. A higher percentage is actually monounsaturated fat. And we have to remember that this steak is not just saturated fat. There are numerous compounds in there, some of which would probably and almost definitely mitigate any sort of deleterious effect that maybe any saturated fat may or may not have. Things like choline, which we know have quite a beneficial effect on the liver. And so it is, sort of, silly to talk about these things in these terms, overfeeding. You know, this is an overfeeding study. Is it easier to overfeed and gorge on, you know, sugary, buttery filled cupcakes, you know, with saturated fat, or is it easier to overconsume steak? I can tell you for me, it's a hell of a lot harder to overconsume steak, and I think most people will find that as well. And easier to overconsume things that contain fructose in them, particularly if they're in the form of sucrose or high fructose corn syrup, you know. So I think this whole sort of pissing contest in Layne's, you know, got a very controversial tone about him. And I think that's his shtick, right? That's his thing. That's how he gets his clicks. Is not, you know, and this, the thing that sort of, you know, he paints people that promote or advocate for low carb, ketogenic, or even carnivore diets as somehow idiots. You know, we're too stupid to know anything. I've got a PhD and you guys don't understand anything. And, you know, I think that is unfortunate, because I think there are some very, very intelligent, well-educated, well-read, very logical, very, very insightful people that do promote ketogenic diets, carnivore diets, low-carb diets for particular reasons. And I think, you know, I think the literature is filled with a number of potentially beneficial reasons why someone may choose to do that. Now, I do agree with him when anyone's out there saying this is the only way, and you'll never hear me saying that this is the only way and this is the best way and everything else is wrong. That's not my stick, for sure. You know, I'm out here telling people, hey, this is a very potentially effective therapeutic option for those people that wish to try it. And I think that is, you know, a more helpful way to do this. And, you know, we have these diet culture wars, and certainly, you know, I make fun of my share of the vegans for clicks. I mean, I'll certainly admit that, but I mean, that is, you know, in part in response to the fact that they are particularly, at least, you know, I'm sure most of them in person are very, very nice, but the ones online are particularly sort of vitriolic with their, you're an animal abuser and a murderer and an evil person because you choose to eat, you know, a food that, gosh, 99% of all humans have ever eaten, you know, that have ever existed have eaten, probably more than that, quite honestly. So anyway, thoughts on that? Let me know what you guys think. What are you guys' thoughts on that? You know, do we understand that saturated fat, and I didn't even go into this, but there's lots of different types of saturated fat. Is it oleic acid, palmitic acid, you know, stearic acid, myristic acid, lauric acid? I mean, on and on and on. There's all types of different saturated fat. So we can't just lump saturated fat and say, oh, you know, it's always bad in all situations, and therefore you shouldn't eat it. You know, anyway, we'll see. More to come. Interesting, there is going to be a really neat saturated fat study coming out in the coming weeks. I'll be talking about that, which will further, in my view, exonerate it. But we'll see. All right, guys. You guys have a great one. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you soon.